Wow, y'all, thank you so much for having me. Let me like adjust and do all the like normal camera things. Tots lahe, tots halach, inem winitwas, atitwatit, sayapo winitwas, tai Simpson, inwas, nimipu ayat, enem nixasa hiwis, timina ilkanich, the loitzat kina. I am so very grateful to be here. I just introduced myself in my native language. I like to joke in some spaces that I just cursed all of you, but since I can't like receive feedback or laughter, I'm gonna try to keep my jokes to a minimum. Maybe I speak fluent sarcasm, y'all. And if you haven't noticed, I actually use she and her pronouns. I know that Ty is a gender ambiguous name, so you just never know what happens when I show up in spaces like this. Um, so, in our discussion today, I want to talk a little bit about how Indigenous communities engage in sustainability and social justice. I want to incorporate, a little bit of traditional storytelling and how that plays a role in land stewardship. I want to talk a little bit about our connections to nature and to knowledge keeping. And then I hope that when we leave here, we'll have a shared understanding of like decolonization practices in our work to protect and engage nature. I'm also an anti-violence advocate. I'll get to that in just a moment. So what does it look like to end violence in Native communities as well? I'm a big proponent of the principle that violence against Indigenous people is violence against our land. So just a really quick housekeeping thing. You will see my advocate, partner in crime, beloved community member, dropping links as I go in the comments. You'll see her name as Amy. She also uses she and her pronouns. She does not need to speak with y'all today, but she is helping me and supporting me and getting you all the resources that I may or may not talk about during our time together. Let's see, y'all. I am on the indigenous territory of the Niwa and Numu nations. We commonly call them the Shoshone, Bannock, Paiute, and Yakama nations, what we now call Boise, Idaho. Idaho is homeland to the Shitsuupsh, commonly known as the Coeur d'Alene tribe, the Nimipu, my tribe, the Nez Perce tribe, and the Kootenai people. And I encourage all of you to use the link in the chat around how you can connect with the territory and like learn about the territory that you are occupying. Our Indigenousness is deeply couched in our relationship to land and to language. And so for us to truly honor Indigenous people, we make land acknowledgements as political statements. Wherever you all are located, whatever city, whatever town would not exist without the violent theft of our Indigenous homelands. So I always try to name that land acknowledgements are not meant to be warm, fuzzy acts of recognition, but powerful political statements. The land that you're on belongs to an Indigenous community, an Indigenous nation, and those are the folks who should have stewardship. We call that campaign the Land Back Campaign, and you can learn more about the Land Back Campaign from the NDN Collective, and I'll have Amy drop that. So when I talk about decolonization, y'all, as we kind of move through our time together, decolonization is about giving land back. No environmental justice movement, no ecological justice movement will see success if land is not returned to the rightful stewards. Let's start with some storytelling, y'all. I told you in my Indigenous language that I am a citizen of the Nimipu Nation, that I'm a descendant of Chief Red Heart of the Nez Perce Nation, that my name is the Storyteller. My storytelling as my name is not only my name, but it's also my cultural and spiritual practice. I tell folks all the time that storytelling is my love language. And my work as an organizer requires storytelling to ensure that our old ways are made new and that we are finding the intersections of innovation and tradition, as one of my Nimipu relatives always likes to say. I use storytelling as a way to connect. So I want us all to do a shared exercise together. I will keep it brief. Usually if we're in the same space together, like I'd be able to like engage you in person. So in this shared space, we're gonna just drop some things in the chat. So please stay engaged with me. So I want you to first relax, take a deep breath. A slow, long belly breath, low in your stomach. And I want you to settle into your body. And I'm going to give you a prompt to think about, to reflect on. And I want you to honor the first story that arises. I want you to lean into discomfort if you feel it. I want you to lean into the joy if you feel it. Lean into whatever your body gives you. Tell me the story of your people. Reflect on that. Who are your people? Feel free to drop that in the comments. And I'll go ahead and use that as our opening story. I told you that I am a descendant of Chief Redheart. I am also a descendant of a long line of beautiful Nimipu matriarchs. If you didn't know, 70% of the indigenous nations in the United States are matriarchies, including my own. The matriarchies in my family, the matriarchs of my family are equal parts fury and equal parts love. And it is a collision of tornadoes and hurricanes, of big laughter, of big joy, of intensity, of seriousness. My people is my mother. She is a healer and a medicine woman. My people are my gram, Enim Katzat. Now, Katz, my mother's mother, we often called her Scylla. She was also a healer and a medicine woman. My people is the matriarch now of my family, my eldest auntie, my auntie Simone. My people includes my Black father, a descendant of enslaved people, indigenous Africans that built this country. My people are my grandparents, Black scholars, the first Black scholars at Northwestern University of Massachusetts, those who built the African American Studies program across this country. My people are my tinies, my descendants, my brother's children. My brother had my children for me since I cannot have my own. And we are all Black, and we are all Indigenous, and we are all powerful, and we are deeply connected to this land for 15,000 years. When we talk about the story of our people, when we tell the story of our people, we are honoring our ancestors in a way that recognizes how much loss took place for me to exist. I was prayed and loved into existence in the Nez Perce War. 1867, in the winter of Montana at Bear Paw, I was prayed and loved into existence by Tamina Ilp Ilp. We not only suffered tumultuous loss, not only have we suffered displacement and fear, but we brought forward laughter, we brought forward joy, we brought forward Nimipu Timtki, the language of the Nez Perce people. We brought forth Atitwatit Ditolkanawit, the stories of my people. We brought forward our deep connection to land, Wayakin, how are we connected to land? We brought forth Himyuma, our connection to each other, where nobody is left behind. We brought forth Waptis, nature herself. These are my people. And it's also important to name that this is who I'm accountable to. I say as the storyteller, Titwatit inahnetsa, the stories that I carry are not my own. And what that means is my stories are passed from generation to generation to me from my ancestors. And the story that I'm writing with my own life is a gift to my descendants. I am accountable to my ancestors. I am accountable to my descendants. These are also my people. This is who I'm accountable to. And I offer this first exercise to you so that we can really think big about sustainability. We can really think big about the way that we need to change our relationship to nature and to water. Change our relationship to each other. Change our relationship to land. We have an obligation to honor our ancestors and to make our descendants proud. So the work that we're doing in this life, the story that we are writing with our own lives, is huge and impactful. And are we doing it in an intentional way that nurtures and centers nature as her own creature? In my language, we say, kus himen was, life, water is life. In Lakota, you hear it as Miniwi Choni. And we don't say water is life because it gives life. We say water is life because she is her own creature. Let me tell you a story because that's who I am as a person. Coyote, Itzieye, called together all of the big creatures at the confluence of the Clearwater and Salmon rivers near what we now call Lewiston, Idaho. Nimipu people call that area Tsiminikam. And on that day, when Salmon called together all of the big creatures, he said, there's going to be a big change coming, and not all of you are going to survive. To carry our stories forward, to carry the land forward and caring for the land forward, we need to give a part of ourselves so that humans can exist. We will not all survive this big change. And it was Natsoch, Salmon, that stepped forward first and said, I will be here for the people. I will come in the winter. They can eat my flesh. I will make sure that I am their first food. Natsoch, Salmon. And it was the river. It was the river who stepped forward next. And she said, I will be home to the salmon so that salmon has some place to live in the winter. And to this day, when we honor the water and we honor the salmon, we honor them in that order, salmon first and then the water, because she is home to our first food. She is home to us ourselves. She was the one who provided us life in the very beginning of humanity because Coyote asked her to. Our relationship to water is very utilitarian now, right? Our relationship to water now is in a way where she serves us and not the other way around. This is my friendly reminder, y'all. Nature doesn't need humanity. Humans need nature. I hope that in telling this story, it's brief. I truncated a very long story into about 3 minutes for y'all. I hope that this short story offers us direction and gives us ways of knowing. Storytelling helps us to understand what the land means, that we are of nature. Storytelling helps us to understand that environmental justice, sustainability, efforts and policy and legislation around sustainability requires Indigenous voices and organizing. My people have been on the land for 15,000 years. I am Nimipu first before I am ever American. I am Nimipu first because the depth of my ancestry is 15,000 years before even a nation state came to be. And because we have this deep knowledge and deep relationship to the land, that helps us to prioritize the way that we interact with her, the way that my people stay engaged, and the way that my people ensure and steward the land so that the land sustains itself, so that we are creating a future for our descendants that in which we live in balance. This ideology is often called decolonization, right? So I'm going to give you all a quick little lesson in decolonization. Decolonization is the intentional reversal of the practices of settler colonization that had adverse and violent impacts on the Indigenous people of this land and Indigenous people across the planet. I try to stay focused on the United States, but Indigenous is Indigenous worldwide, y'all. Whether one person participates in settler colonialism is not entirely a matter of when or how one's ancestors came to the United States. Having settler privilege means that some combination of one's economic security, United States citizenship, sense of relationship to the land, mental and physical health, cultural integrity, family values, career aspirations, and spiritual lives are not possible, literally, without the territorial dispossession of Indigenous people. I will say that for you one more time because it's complicated. Settler colonialism means that our entire existence as a body politic, as a community of the United States, was not possible without the territorial dispossession of Indigenous people. So to decolonize is the act of returning land stewardship to Indigenous people, literally. When we say land back, that's exactly what we mean. I encourage you to engage with NDN Collective a little bit more on this idea of decolonization, but I just wanted to make sure that we all had a shared understanding of decolonization before I move forward in our discussion. I am a director of social change for the Idaho Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence. In my work, I serve specifically Indigenous nations around interrupting the disparate rates of violence in and around Indigenous communities, especially affecting Indigenous women. I am a subject matter expert on missing and murdered Indigenous people, serving on the Idaho Criminal Justice Commission on missing and murdered Indigenous people. I am also an activist and an organizer. I co-founded a nonprofit in Idaho called the Indigenous Idaho Alliance, a socio-political organization that serves to interrupt the systems that perpetuate marginalization and oppression against Indigenous communities. In my work, I've realized that what looks like activism to y'all, if you are not of an Indigenous community, what looks like activism to y'all is actually survival for me and for my people. I walk in two worlds. And what I mean by that is that Indigenous people have to cling to our language and our culture and our spirituality and the depths of our ancestry and the possibilities of our descendancy, while at the same time navigating settler colonial spaces like universities, professional associations, capitalism, patriarchy, and I can go on and on. We have to do both. It's a complicated existence to be able to walk in two worlds. And it's something that adversely affects Indigenous people in a unique way. Our cultures survived in the face of violence. Our languages, most of them, survived in the face of violence as well. And it's important to recognize that we are carrying multiple truths and multiple realities at the same time. Walking in two worlds also impacts the way that we navigate sustainability and environmental justice. Indigenous knowledge is knowledge. Indigenous knowledge is science. Advancing Indigenous environmental justice is rooted in Indigenous knowledge and epistemology. And the reason why that's important is because we have this really strange dichotomy where we believe that science only exists in Western white academic spaces. My people, again, have been here for 15,000 years. That sounds like 15,000 years worth of science and knowledge of the land. When we talk about sustainability efforts, Indigenous people shouldn't just be consulted. We should be leading and informing the work. And unless you are Indigenous, your people do not have 15,000 years of Indigenous stewardship knowledge. Environmental organizations in the United States largely remain segregated. The most recent and publicly available data notes that like 80% of boards of directors, 85% of staff of environmental nonprofits are white. That's problematic because we're limiting our knowledge to only a couple hundred years rather than expanding and including 15,000 years of cultural knowledge and cultural science. And this is where storytelling plays a part, right? We're used to data and numbers and quantitative analysis and qualitative analysis and our sample size of N, et cetera. I'm a social scientist, I'm a political scientist, so I understand the need for data. But we cannot exclude or limit the way we engage in data and science only to these numbers written in books and libraries by predominantly white scientists. What do Indigenous people have to say? What can our stories tell you? Let me give you an example of that. When humans were created, we made this agreement with Itzieye, with Coyote, that we would keep nature in balance, that we would protect the sacred, and we would always give back to our communities. Our responsibility was to keep nature in balance. That's a tenet of our communities. But we fast forward to now, right? Where we extract from the earth for minerals, for plastic. We extract from the earth for fossil fuels. The ocean was on fire this year. Late stage capitalism. Salmon have remained on the endangered species list for 30 years. We have just now rejuvenated the lamprey in the Clearwater and Columbia rivers. Indigenous people use seasons to navigate how we engage with nature. We committed to not hunt cow elk in the winter in case those cows are carrying their calves. We committed to eating the steelhead only in the winter after it has returned from the ocean. We know where to find the cure for poison ivy, which is usually right next to poison ivy. Our Indigenous stories, our Indigenous knowledge is science. So our conversations around sustainability, our conversations around environmental justice absolutely have to center our voices as Indigenous people. What does this look like in practical application? Who's on the nonprofit boards? Who's on your advisory committees? Who is on your, who are your management staff? Are you incorporating and taking partnerships with community organizing? Who are the Indigenous organizations with boots on the ground? Who are the Indigenous organizations supporting community care and mutual aid? Who are planning and executing direct action around preventing further violence against the land? The land is her own creature, and she is a creation, and she has autonomy, and we have a responsibility to her. And balance is the only thing that she's ever asked of us. We never take all the berries off the bush. We hunt seasonally. We respect what's old and we honor what's new. And we celebrate and honor water as her own creature as well. The West and everything about the United States history of settler colonialism is because of the continued undisturbed condition of the region's landscape and biological resources. So what I mean by that is there is a statistic that we've started to understand where 5% of the world's indigenous people are responsible for stewarding 80% of the biodiversity across the globe. And yet we are not nearly elected to policy making positions. We are not nearly holding enough of the nonprofit and sustainability organizations leadership where we can continue to contribute our old ways and Coyote stories as part of our relationship to sustainability and the land and the water. There's a really great example of like illustrating who Indigenous people are to the land and to the animals that sustain us. There's an Alaskan elder who explains, and I quote, "We are caribou people. Caribou are not just what we eat, they are who we are. They are in our stories and our songs and the whole way we see the world. Caribou are our life, and without caribou, we wouldn't exist," end quote. And that's what our relationship to nature looks like. And centering that relationship to nature absolutely is tantamount to moving forward using a social justice lens, using an equity lens to protect nature and keep her in balance. We are not separate from nature. We are of her. I also want to address a little bit too when we have these conversations. This is where I'm going to move into my anti-racism, anti-oppression educator hat. I've got several hats and spaces in different spaces around this work. Many of us don't understand that we perpetuate the use of pedigree and microaggressions when we are working with Indigenous people. Unless you are of a nation with spirit animals, you don't have one. Our medicines cannot and should not be bought in Urban Outfitters, y'all. We are not mascots. We are not costumes. Halloween is always a headache for Indigenous communities. And I say that because it makes it difficult for us to build community with non-Native folks when we have to continue to build that community in the face of negative stereotypes, misconceptions, and inaccurate narratives around who Indigenous people are. I am a big proponent of land back. I am a big proponent of taking care of nature. But on the same token, it's complicated, right? We are trying to divest from fossil fuels, but I drive a Ford F-150, y'all. But here's the thing. I can't harvest elk and put dead elk in the back of a Prius. If that were possible, I would have tried it by now. It's just not possible. Gotta feed my people. So what I'm saying ultimately is that it is complicated to build a relationship with nature at the intersections of our contemporary lives now. But we really have to think about it with a strong descendancy plan in place. For those of you who work in in environmental justice, are you, if you work in environmental justice, are you Indigenous led and why not? If you don't have Indigenous leadership, you are in fact perpetuating white saviorism despite your best intentions. At the end of the day, donating money isn't enough if it means Indigenous people have to uphold systems of white supremacy. And there's nothing about compromise that is good for Indigenous people at this point. We have given up all of the land. We have given up many of our languages. We have given up so many of our cultures. There is no both sides to this argument. We assert sovereignty and we demand our land back. And until those things happen, sustainability, environmental justice, those things are really just lip service. They are performative, but it is possible. I don't want this to feel like hopeless, right? All things are possible, and our relationship to nature can be restored and rejuvenated in a deeply powerful way that allows us to really commit and honor our future generations. So where do the intersections of social justice land here? Hashtag land back, hashtag MMIW, hashtag water is life. Like social justice as a trend is problematic in our work towards environmental justice. We like the fleeting and warm fuzzies. All social justice movements have to be more than that. We have to look at intersectionality. We have to look at the intergenerational harm caused by settler colonialism. Kyle White writes, and I quote again, "This is why so many of our environmental movements are about stopping sexual and state violence against Indigenous people, reclaiming ethical self-determination across diverse urban and rural ecosystems, empowering gender justice and gender fluidity, transforming lawmaking to be consensual, healing intergenerational traumas, and calling out all practices that erase Indigenous histories, cultures, and experiences," end quote. So I will say that more clearly for you. Violence against Indigenous people, racism and oppression and marginalization of Indigenous people is violence against the land. The way that we treat the land is the way that we treat each other. That brings me to my next point. I am you and you are me, and we are all connected. And I know some of you got really excited when I started speaking my Indigenous language. Like folks all the time, like get really excited and want to tell me how much Cherokee pedigree they have, but we don't have to do that. We're not connected in that way. But it reminded me of a moment when I was in the Atlantic Ocean. I saw the Atlantic Ocean for the first time 2 years ago now. Wow, time is a spiral. 2 years, actually, it's been close to 3 years. I saw the Atlantic Ocean. I got to stand in her. I got to feel her power and hear her sound and listen to her song. And it was a very powerful moment for me because I lived in Southeast Asia for a really long time. The Pacific Ocean is my jam. And it felt like I had brought my life full circle to have stood in the Atlantic Ocean and spent so much of my life in the Pacific Ocean and know that all of the water is connected and it has touched all of us and it has been in each of us and it is in each of us. Intersectionality, interconnectedness, centering Indigenous voices. All of these three facets are huge in moving forward in a good way around environmental justice and sustainability. A couple of calls to action for y'all. And then I'm going to circle back to some more stories. I'm just trying to keep track of time too. Let me time check myself. Sophia, how am I doing for time? I probably have another 15 minutes to speak before questions. Good. Perfect. Okay. Calls to action before some stories. Done it to, which is 1 noon my time. Okay. Thank you. I encourage you all to get educated. Educate yourself about Native issues, lands, and environmental activism. And this includes educating yourself on the theft of Native lands and resources and how this has contributed to the United States development. Violence against the land has started from a long time ago. I don't want us to relegate Indigenous people, Indigenous land stewardship to a thing of the past. We are very much still here. We shall remain. We shall remain into the future. We are powerful communities with incredible languages and dynamic cultures and community engagement and community building. Which brings me to my next thing, connect with Native organizations. There is no shortage of Native organizations doing environmental and climate-related work. They are the ones who should be consulted and consent to the work that you're doing in sustainability. Form intentional, meaningful connections with these organizations and Native leaders. And when you, here's a side note, if you invite Native people to a space, feed them. Food is love and a backbone of our culture, y'all. If you are trying to ask for something or input or consultation from Indigenous people, please feed them. Otherwise, you should just send an email. If I show up in a space and there's no food, like I get really hangry. Food is love, and food is the way to get Native organizations and Native environmental justice leaders to the table. Invest in Native organizations. Philanthropy needs to invest in Native environmental and climate justice work. Again, I cannot say this or scream this loud enough. Indigenous folks need to lead your sustainability and environmental justice movements. And here's going to be one that doesn't land well for some of you. Move beyond whiteness. Move beyond whiteness. Philanthropy and mainstream environmental and climate justice organizations need to move beyond white-centered frameworks in advancing justice. Indigenous peoples have time-tested knowledge systems that are invaluable to advancing environmental and climate justice. Invaluable. Again, 15,000 years of science. Avoid this idea of same boat approach, right? Like environmental issues are humanity issues, right? However, when we say we're all in the same boat when it comes to land justice and water justice, not all of us are in the same boat. Some have a yacht, some have a kayak, some are on the like shipwreck board from the Titanic where there's no room for but one person. We have to avoid that same boat approach. Environmental justice sits at the intersections of socioeconomics, classism, socio-political behavior, racism, and oppression. We have to look at all of the facets of who we are collectively as a community before we can address environmental justice and sustainability in a way that includes everybody's voices, especially those voices that have been minoritized and silenced in the face of settler colonialism. I encourage each of you to uplift the Indigenous wisdom and spirituality. This means that do not appropriate. It just means that you are uplifting and center the way Indigenous people show up to honor land. You are showing up in a way that centers our voices around storytelling. Don't show up with Robert rules of orders. Decolonize time. Decolonize your agendas. Right? Make room for story circles. Make room for community engagement around food. You go to powwow. Don't make Indigenous people come to you. You show up where Indigenous folks are and let them lead. And that takes time. That takes an investment. That takes a commitment, because no longer is it appropriate to use the 70s era anthropology where white folks with enthusiasm and energy show up and extract knowledge, intellectual and emotional labor from Indigenous people, and then go make money after writing a book. That era is no longer appropriate, and it's unacceptable. Indigenous people are scholars and scientists and biologists and leaders in the work to bring nature back in balance. Uplift that wisdom, uplift that spirituality, uplift that language. Learn the name of the land that you're on. What do Indigenous people call themselves on the land that you occupy? Not Cherokee, not Nez Perce, not Sioux, not any of these colonizer names that were forced upon us, but we call ourselves Ninipu, Titolkien, Lakota, Dene, Lenape. Who are the people that occupy your land? So those are my calls to action for y'all. And in this last bit, I'm going to give you a bit of a historical lens for why violence and land justice intersect, and then we'll move into some questions. Nearly 80%, or I told you, 70% of the Indigenous nations in the United States have been matriarchies. So during first contact of settler colonialism, it behooved white settlers to destabilize communities by committing violence against the women of that community. We are story keepers, we are knowledge keepers, we are language keepers, we are the literal backbone and foundation of entire communities as matriarchs and baby matriarchs. To destabilize a community means to violently oppress the women of that community. Many of our nations that are matriarchies, our creation stories are based on womanhood. And I say womanhood as expansive as that means and inclusive as that means for each of you. The river is a she, water is life. Women give life in the way that nature gives life, and that is powerful. We are deeply connected to Creator in that way. Violating the water, violating the land, is violating violently the women, Indigenous women of this country. So what does it mean in my calls to action a step further for you to center Indigenous women's voices in your sustainability movements, in your social justice movements? How can we intentionally make room for circles of elders, for youth, Indigenous youth? Indigenous youth should be guiding and instructing and informing the way that we do this work. They inherit the earth after us. They inherit nature, and they also inherit our mess. The ocean was on fire, y'all. How am I going to explain that to my grandchildren? I've given you a lot to think about, and I've chatted about a myriad, multifaceted approach to the way that we understand land justice and social justice and water rights. Some of the key things I want y'all to take away. Decolonize y'all's practices and approaches to land justice and environmental justice. Move away from Western academic models. Decolonize your methodologies of science. Intentionally center Indigenous folks, Indigenous women, Indigenous young folks, Two-Spirit folks, those who identify as queer and trans in your leadership of environmental justice. In my community, we call our Two-Spirit folks Tseepmais. Tseepmais. And what that means is all of the things all at once. That's how it loosely translates anyway. Which means that folks who are Two-Spirit connect to the land and connect to the water and connect to the animals and connect to each other all at once, all of the things all at once. They are very powerful spiritual folks who can also impactfully inform the way that we do our environmental justice work. The story that we are writing with our lives has to be a good story. We don't want to write a bad story with a bad ending, with dystopia and nature imbalance, and then push that into the future to our descendants. We need to do the work now that impacts 7 and 10 and 25 generations into the future. We may not see this world that we're envisioning of collective thriving, of nature imbalance, and of giving back. We may not see that come to fruition in our lifetimes. It's actually very unlikely. But we have to believe and envision that something is bigger and better than the way that we're behaving now. That there is another way, that there are third and fourth ways, that there are third, fourth, and fifth ways to engage in environmental justice equity, because we're not looking at sustainability. We're not looking at justice. What we want is thriving. What we want is balance. What we want is liberation. And there's always hope. That comes from big hope. It comes from big love. And it comes from a commitment to do better for now and generations into the future. I'm going to stop a few minutes early so we can get started with questions, because I'm sure folks have them. Thank you all so much. Go ahead and give your drop your questions in the chat, and then we can go from there, and I will answer them as best as I can. I will disclaim something for you. I do not always answer all of the questions because sometimes questions are inappropriate, and I will tell you. I will also, at the end of our time together, drop my emails, and you have about a week to reach out to me so I can answer your questions and give you any follow-up as necessary. For one moment, though, I'm going to stop my camera and go grab some water while you are dropping your questions in the chat. I will be back in just a moment. I think one of my favorite parts about doing Zoom keynotes is you can't tell if I have pants on or not. Okay. Let's see. I'm going to go back and read some of these comments. I am not familiar with that book, but that's actually my next favorite thing. I always drop in what books I'm currently reading, and like I'm actually always reading books if you can't tell. But The Red Deal, I encourage everybody to go grab this book. I think it's like $15, and the money goes into the Red Media organization dedicated to the liberation of Native peoples from capitalism and colonialism, and it centers Indigenous political narratives. So The Red Deal, Indigenous action to save our earth. So thank you for your book suggestion, and I'm giving you one back. NDN Collective recently published required reading on climate justice, adaptation, and investing in Indigenous power. You can get this one from ndncollective.org. So please, those are my suggested readings in this same vein around environmental justice that are Indigenous led. Let's see. I really love your stories of your people, y'all. Thank you. And look at the connections too, right? Like how we folks immigrated, how folks got here, what they're doing now, the way that we are each contributing to a better world. Thank you for your comments around deeper truths, going deeper than what we think. Y'all have stories of survival and resilience. We need to extend that compassion to each other. When you tell the story of your people, you are creating space for shared understanding, for changing the world. One of my favorite facilitations that I do is a storyteller's guide to changing the world. I've done it at Penn State. I did it at UCSD. And I have a really great time with that because it allows folks to engage in their own story and then build connections around how those shared stories move us towards collective thriving. So that's one of my favorite exercises. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for sharing films. Protecting the sacred. Thank you, Elizabeth, for naming that. What is my opinion about land acknowledgements? That is a really great question. I don't give land acknowledgements. So if you really listen to mine was a land back acknowledgement, right? This is the land I'm on, give the land back. Land acknowledgements wouldn't be necessary if Indigenous folks were returned to their rightful stewardship of Indigenous homelands. So they are deeply political statements. They are not for warm fuzzies. Land acknowledgements are a call to action rather than this really ironic statement. What tends to happen is land acknowledgements are given by settler colonizers on settler colonized land, which is ironic and funny and sardonic, right? All of the things. So I don't particularly love them. I just think that in these virtual spaces, it's important for us to recognize that everywhere we are is all Indigenous land. So thank you for asking that question. And thank you for dropping a blog about writing a land acknowledgement. There are some articles around doing more, like beyond land acknowledgements, and I encourage you all to look those up. Let's see. There's another question. How can we best work together to bring the earth back in balance? Capitalism is a problem. Capitalism at its root means that some people have and some people don't have. And the chasm that exists between who has and who doesn't is huge now. And it comes at the cost of land theft. It comes at the cost of land and mineral extraction. It comes at the cost of clean water. Dismantling capitalism and or adjusting our relationship to capitalism is one facet of bringing Earth back into balance. Also, overdevelopment is also a problem, like really looking at how and where and why we develop land, urban sprawl, that sort of thing, really exploring the long-term impacts of that. And I'll give you this really interesting example. In a former life, I worked at an insurance company, and it was along Highway 12 in Idaho. If you look it up, we call it the Gauntlet because it's along the Clearwater River. It's river on one side and then like mountain and rocks on the other side, and it's narrow and windy, and it connects Idaho to Montana over the Bitterroot Mountains. People hit animals all the time. They're in accidents because of the rock slides. There's any number of impact on traveling on that road. And I remember all of the time folks coming in like, oh, I hit this damn deer. I don't understand why they just can't stay off the road. And in my brain, as an Indigenous person, I'm thinking to myself, like, too bad we built a road through their migration pattern, like through their movement pattern, which is really interesting, right? Because we have now shifted our brain to be entitled to land and development with little to no thought or around the aftermath of what occurs to the natural habitat for these animals, what occurs around like the impact of those roads on the, sorry, how can I explain this? There was one chunk of this highway that needed reconstruction. And what ultimately happened was that they removed a bunch of trees off the hillside and then caused a whole rock slide in the aftermath. The trees were preventing the rock slide. Like, nature keeps itself in balance without us interrupting it, but then we interrupt it and cause even more damage and further harm to both nature and the water. So really reevaluating that. Balance is attainable. It has been attainable, and we can do it again. And I think that nature is much more resilient than we give her credit for. Again, nature doesn't need us. We need nature. So we just need to be more mindful about how we move in our relationship to capitalism, to extraction, to development, etc. So those are a start. And actually, there are some. The Red New Deal actually has very distinct this is how. And so I encourage you to read that book. Is matriarchy in Indigenous communities a recent phenomenon? No, it's old. It's deep. Again, 15,000 years. I've been a matriarchy for a long time. And I can give you a little bit of history lesson there. So Indigenous women as matriarchs were landowners, decision makers, essentially community leaders. We still operate that way informally, but following the Indian Allotment Act, the Dawes Act, and then settler colonialism, the United States basically implemented this microcosm of the federal government into many of the Indigenous nations across the United States. For example, we have a governing body of 9 elected officials that is administered by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. That is not culturally or traditionally how we govern ourselves. It's just a tiny variation of the federal government, if that makes sense. We have our own tribal court system. We have an office of legal counsel in the way that there's an attorney general and the way that there is a Supreme Court. So it's just big federal government on a tiny Indian reservation based on the parameters of our treaties. There are 573 Indigenous nations in the United States. Not all of them have treaties, but every treaty is different. So the way that we all operate is different in the parameters of settler colonialism. All of that to say, pre-settler colonialism, we were matriarchies and we governed ourselves in a very utilitarian socialist sort of a way, and not socialism in the way that offends people, but just a community oriented. There is enough, we share, there is abundance, there everybody plays a part and a role and supports each other, we take care of each other, and we still model and practice those ways currently, even in the face of patriarchy, capitalism, and settler colonialism. So that is a very 3-minute version of history and the impact of settler colonialism on our very, very old matriarchies. Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee is a great book. Thank you. The Red Deal, currently reading. Thank you. How do you engage youth in topics of decolonization and making change? Exactly that. Hey, young folks, what is your understanding of decolonization? Here's a great prompt that I really use. All things, set aside all things, money, location, adults, lawmakers. What is your big vision for the future? What do you want for future generations? If you ask young people that, they will give you these beautiful kaleidoscopes of how nature should be, how we should be in nature. We use in anti-violence work culture as prevention. And so generally young folks really want to engage in their culture. And those cultural practices are tangible, tactile relationships to nature: hunting, fishing, gathering, sewing, harvesting tool to weave for mat, tule to weave mats. So there are oh, I see you. Okay.
Hey, Ty.
Yeah. Any number of ways to engage young folks. Thank you so much. So they said finish at 2. I thought it was like stop talking and answer questions. So sorry about the way that timing landed, y'all. At least I'll let you take away and I'll just engage in the chat.